recording. Okay. And it's noon, so I'm going to just go ahead and go. This is Kirsten with iCodva, and welcome to this webinar on stalking. It's been a really long time since I did such a webinar. I was trying to look back through what we have recorded, and it looks like the last time I did anything on stalking would have been in 2010. So even though I've done a lot of in-person training on this, it seems like it was time to go ahead and do a webinar and get it recorded and have it be available so that people have easy access to it online. The other nice thing about having it available online is that it can be closed captioned, so it's more accessible to people. And there's been a couple law changes, so if you have not done any stalking training on Iowa law in a long time, then maybe there'll be a few new things for you. I really am going to be focusing on the legal system and not too much. I will talk a little bit about what survivors can do, but not too much. Let's just go. Everybody likes stats, so I'm going to just quickly throw stats at you. The Bureau of Justice Statistics does their last nationwide publication was in 2012, and that's it was based on earlier data, and they recrunched the numbers, but basically you're talking about a little over 2% of women in the United States every year and almost 1% of men every year being stalked. Men and women are harassed at the same rates, but women are stalked at double the rate. And how they figured, in terms of what questions they were asking, they asked kind of this list: have you received unwanted phone calls? Have you had somebody spread rumors about you? And they counted it as stalking if that thing had happened on 2 or more occasions. I don't know that it included cyber stalking because these are the specific behaviors right here. So maybe in terms of email, this included cyber stalking, but they were asking about these specific behaviors. Had those things happened and in the past year? And if the person said yes, they'd experienced at least one of those behaviors on at least 2 separate occasions, and that as a result of that they had feared for their safety, they counted that as being stalked rather than asking people, have you been stalked? Because everybody has kind of a different understanding of what that means. I don't know off the top of my head how they distinguished that from harassment. I don't know if they did harassment if the person wasn't afraid, or if they did harassment if it only happened once, but anyway, there you go. That's the research that they did. And of course, no surprise that intimate partner stalkings pose the greatest risk. When you read about stalking, why isn't this going ahead? There we go. When you read about stalking, there's all these different people coming up with different typologies of stalkers, and sometimes there's 3 types of stalkers, and sometimes there's 2 types, and sometimes there's 5 types, and whatever. Nobody can really seem to agree, except that there is, in fact, one type that is really, really dangerous. So I don't pay much attention to all of that, except to know we know that intimate partner stalkings pose the greatest risk to survivors, and that 1 in 10 women at some point in their life will be stalked by an intimate partner. So, and usually 6 months or less, but there are some cases that can go on for years and years and years. Nothing there that you didn't know. Why do we care particularly? Is because stalking is one of those biggest red flags for potentially lethal domestic abuse. Jacqueline Campbell and a whole bunch of other people did pretty extensive research on not only intimate partner homicides, but also they looked at cases where essentially it should have been a homicide, but the person survived. And the advantage of looking at those cases as well is they could actually sit down and interview, so they could get even more information. And the thing that most intimate partner homicides have in common is prior stalking behavior. More numbers. And since I'm sending this out, you can read it at your leisure. Just a little asterisk in terms of, so why are folks engaging in this behavior? And essentially, a stalker has a belief system, and then they want to find facts to prove that it's true. So they feel betrayed. They have this big hole, and only their target can fix it or fill it. And they have I can't stand it-itis. In other words, their feelings are so unbearable, and only, again, that partner, only by doing something to that partner can they relieve those unbearable feelings. And that comes down to essentially 3 goals in terms of impacting that target person. One is I want to keep or get that relationship back, and that will make me feel whole again. Another is if I can prove that this is all my partner's fault, if I can prove that I'm the good guy here and I'm the one that's been victimized in this, then I will be vindicated and I will feel whole again. Or simply, if I can make that person feel as bad as I do, then I will feel better. And then there's 3 different general sets of behaviors, if you will, that you can categorize stalking into. One of them is just getting information. Like for that person who wants vindication, they're searching for proof of betrayal. They're searching for proof that their partner has done something bad, evil to hurt them. And that can include all of the cyber stalking you want. It can include like going through the trash would be looking for evidence. I had a coworker at one point who was whose partner would go through her garbage looking for any kind of like phone numbers or address or names of anybody to prove that she was having an affair, which she wasn't, but if he could find such a thing, then that would be evidence of it. Another broad category of behaviors is the intimidation and threats. I'm going to scare you into apologizing to me. I'm going to scare you into coming back to this relationship. I'm going to punish you for leaving. That would be that revenge thing. And it can, again, be all kinds of things under intimidation and threats. I had a client whose cat was suddenly missing and returned a couple of days later minus one of its legs. So that was a very strong, threatening message of, you better come back to me or else. Sometimes these things are really subtle, and sometimes it can be about, I'm simply going to mess with you. If you think about the punishment of, I'm going to break into your house, and I'm just going to move things around a little bit so that when you come home, you're not sure if things have been moved or not. That can be both, I'm punishing you by making you constantly not feel safe in your home, but also that threat and intimidation of, if I can do that, what else could I do? And these, those goals of revenge and intimidation and reconciliation they can flip back and forth between those in seconds. So like, I'm going to first intimidate you into getting you back into reconciliation. But if that doesn't work, then I can immediately switch to punishing you for not reconciling with me. Attempts to destroy reputation, again, that can occur online. That can occur in terms of false reports to certification boards for your job. There was a professor at ISU whose partner was awaiting attempted murder charges because he came on campus and tried to stab her to death. And during that time he was awaiting trial, he managed to spam repeatedly all the faculty and all the students at ISU with email messages about how she had falsified her resume, she didn't have the award she said, et cetera, all of these accusations to undermine her as a victim, to undermine her as a witness in the case. So stalking even from jail. That was lovely. Stalkers tend to use some pretty, just like there's a power and control wheel of really common behaviors, there's a power and control wheel, if you will. There's a set of really common behaviors that folks use when they stalk. One of them is guilt. You're the only one who understands me. You said you cared about me. Why are you doing this? If you really were the person that you say you are, you wouldn't be doing this. You would let me have closure, which kind of leads to that next one, the manipulation. If you would just do such and such, I'll never talk to you again. If you just do such and such, I'll leave you alone. So that the idea that for that survivor, if I just let them have this one thing, we can be done, I can be rid of this, I can make it stop, is this carrot that is constantly held out that keeps them engaged in communicating with that person. Blackmail, of course. I'll post these nude photos of you on the web. I'll file a child abuse report against you. The goading into disproving accusations can be very similar to the guilt. I knew you were a bitch like all the others. You don't care about anyone but yourself. And, somebody hearing that is prompted to defend themselves. And that defense often comes in doing what that stalker wants you to do. Of course, we know that folks doing harm are really good at manipulating by twisting words and by just kind of drowning someone in twisted logic so that their head is spinning around and they don't know what to think anymore. So you're just saying that because your family has brainwashed you. Just because you don't want to see me doesn't mean I can't talk to you on the phone. Just because that restraining order said such and such doesn't mean I can't do this other thing, until a person just is exhausted, essentially, and likely to acquiesce to whatever the stalker is demanding because they're just tired. And it's easier to go along with it than to keep resisting and defending yourself. And of course, gifts that, again, can go along with guilt. Often the gifts are overly extravagant, really expensive, or time-consuming, and then the person can be, gee, you treat me this way after all I've done for you. Like, yeah, well, I didn't really want you to fix my car. I didn't really want you to give me this gift, and now I feel obligated because you've done those things, right? So that set of behaviors is kind of the big realm of what stalking looks like in actual practice. So let's turn and let's talk about the law in Iowa. Laws do vary from state to state. Iowa, I know that we don't see a lot of cases prosecuted as stalking, but in fact, Iowa has a really good stalking law. So let's talk about some of the reasons it's really good. First of all, let's break it down into chunks. It is part of the assault code. So stalking is considered a form of assault. And so you are stalking if you purposefully engage in a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel terrorized, frightened, intimidated, or threatened. And so one of the more recent changes has been that adding in the terrorized and frightened, because it used to just say to have that person feel that they are going to be injured or killed. And now it's adding in the idea of the fear that stalking generates. So there's that part of a stalking case. And then, or to fear, and this is the part that used to be there, that the person intends to cause bodily injury to or the death of that specific person or member of that specific person's immediate family. So if, for example, you're targeting my child, that would have placed me in fear for my child, and therefore you can be stalking me by threatening to harm my child. The last piece of that stalking crime is that the person who has been accused has knowledge or should have knowledge that a reasonable person would feel terrorized, frightened, intimidated, or threatened, or fear the bodily injury, etc. This is, again, a little bit different because in the past, there was a requirement that not only would a reasonable person feel intimidated, but that target person was in fact afraid and intimidated. And this is a kind of a substitution. So you don't actually have to have a survivor say, yes, I was terrified. All you have to have is somebody else looking at the case and going, yeah, if that was happening to me, I think most people would be afraid. That's important because sometimes we have survivors who are not necessarily afraid, but the behavior can be really weird. They'll say, I'm not afraid, and that's often really just exhaustion. They're too tired to be afraid anymore, but a reasonable person would be afraid. And unless that witness could get on the stand and talk about their fear, the prosecutor really didn't have a case. And this now doesn't require that. If the jury would look at that and go, yeah, that's pretty creepy, that would bother me, that's enough. And Vaughn, I'm seeing that you're having audio problems, and if you are, I think there's a button there, let me pull it up, where you can ask for another access code if there's problems. Or if you're on the phone, try hanging up and using your computer audio, or vice versa. That's my best suggestions. Okay, and keep rolling here. So part of that definition, again, you have to break things down, is a person engages in a course of conduct, and that's a course of conduct without legitimate purpose. And what does a course of conduct mean? It really means on two or more times. That's what the word repeatedly is specifically defined as, 2 or more times without legitimate purpose. One of the things about stalking behaviors that makes them tricky is they are sometimes coded, or they have specific meaning between that person doing harm and that survivor that maybe outsiders don't understand. So that the only time you're ever going to get flowers from me is on your grave, and now flowers start showing up at work. That is a coded message that sometimes it would be hard to show why a reasonable person would be afraid of getting flowers at work, particularly from a contrite, apologizing partner, right? And when I said it can also include immediate family member, you're talking people who live in your household, the people you'd usually think of, spouse, parent, child. I want to talk about this a little bit. When we think about how many times restraining orders are violated, and we think about how stalking is one of our biggest risk red flags, it's important to tie those two things together and understand that when somebody is violating a restraining order repeatedly, they are stalking. And not only are they stalking, but that behavior also meets the code definition for prosecution as stalking rather than just violation of a restraining order. In order to get a restraining order, that person has, particularly a permanent order, right? That person has gone to court and they have had a judge basically say, you've been doing this behavior, knock it off. Your behavior is unwanted. And so that means they've already done something once. Remember, you have to show repeatedly. You have to show a pattern. So they've done something once. 2, you have no less proof than a judge saying your behavior is unwanted, knock it off. So you can even prove the date and time that they should have understood that they needed to stop that behavior. So now if you can show that they have violated an order again, there's your pattern of behavior, because that would be the second time. Plus, you've already shown that the behavior is unwanted and causes fear, because that's what the judge said when they got the order. So if you have a violation of a restraining order, you have stalking, both in reality and under the Iowa Code. And the other reason that that's important is that is somebody who's refusing to have their behavior limited. That's why that is such a red flag. I don't care what my partner says. I don't care what the cops say. I don't care what the judge says. No one can tell me what to do. That's a highly escalated person. It is actually easier, and this is something to you can get restraining orders for stalking, and you know what? I should have thought about that and sent it out and included it. I did not. You know what? When I'm done with this, let me see if I can get a hold of the application and send it out. I'll see what I can do. That did not even cross my mind. Good catch. That's a very good catch. One thing to keep in mind when you're trying to talk with a prosecutor about restraining orders and stalking is it's actually easier to prove a stalking case than to prove the violation of a restraining order. And that's about the difference between what's considered a general intent crime and a specific intent crime. If somebody has violated a restraining order, that is a crime that has where the prosecutor has to prove specific intent. In other words, they have to prove, 1, that the person did intentionally commit that act that was illegal, and 2, in committing that act, they also intentionally intended the result. So not only did I mean to go to my partner's house that I'm not supposed to be at, but I also went there with the intent of violating the restraining order and, causing them fear or whatever. And what you have, and you've probably seen this in practice, what you have is somebody saying, well, when that violation happened, I didn't intend to violate that order. I was just dropping off, one example of a case, I was just dropping off the mittens. The kids had left their mittens in the car. So I didn't actually intend to violate the restraining order. I was just dropping the mittens off, and I didn't know my ex was going to be home at the time. Or I violated the restraining order by sending out that text saying Happy Thanksgiving, which might have been a coded message. But that was an accident. So yes, I committed the act, but I sent it to several people. So I did intend to send a text, but I didn't intend to violate the order when I sent the text and commit. So that is a higher level, because the prosecutor has to show essentially what's in the person's head. Every time they have to show intent, they have to show what that perpetrator was thinking, and that's really hard. And they can always come up with legitimate purpose, with legitimate reasons why they did that thing, because that's what they're good at. A general intent crime means, the prosecutor has to show that they did the illegal act, but they don't have to show whether or not they intended the result of that act. Like, I can show that you meant to fire that gun. I don't have to show that you've fired that gun with the intent of actually shooting that person. The fact that you fired that gun is enough, and you can be guilty of that crime. So, if I haven't confused you enough, violation of restraining order is specific intent. I have to show what the perp was thinking. Violating stalking is general intent. All I have to show is that you did that act without legitimate purpose on 2 or more occasions. I don't have to show whether or not you intended to be stalking when you did that. And even if that seems really confusing for you, that language is something that your prosecutor will understand and might give them pause to think. And if they're really confused, maybe they should call the Attorney General's Prosecuting Attorney Training Council and ask about stalking and prosecuting stalking and thinking about it as a general intent crime instead of specific intent. So how do these cases proceed? Very similar to domestic abuse. There is, if the court is presented with evidence that meets probable cause that stalking has occurred, they are required to issue an arrest warrant. They can't just give somebody a summons to come, like a traffic violation, come to court on March 27th and present your evidence. It has to be an arrest warrant. Similarly, if police have probable cause, or if police are issued a court order, they actually have to take the person into custody. They can't just cite them like it's a traffic violation and tell them when they need to be court and let them go. They have to take them into custody, and they cannot be let go until they actually appear before a judge or magistrate. And again, it proceeds very much like a domestic abuse case, where there's here's your bail, here's the charge. There's often, if not usually, a no contact order put in place, et cetera, et cetera. The penalties are somewhat similar to domestic abuse cases as well. Kind of the baseline is that it's an aggravated misdemeanor, but that can become a more serious offense if there's already a restraining order in place, if the person is stalking and they have a dangerous weapon, or if the person that they're targeting is a minor, then it's going to be bumped up to a Class D felony. And it's one of those situations where the more times you're convicted, the more the penalty goes up. So by the time you've committed a third, and by the time you've been convicted 2 times before, the third time you're convicted, it's going to be bumped up to a Class C felony. So there's stalking, and then kind of right along with it in the code is the harassment issue. And this is something that the two are kind of best buddies, stalking and harassment. So I did want to, there's a couple changes under harassment that you might want to know about. Harassment is that intent to intimidate, annoy, or alarm another person. And the way you might intimidate, annoy, or alarm another person is by communicating with them constantly without legitimate purpose. Again, even if they're not afraid, if they're just annoyed. By simulating an explosive device, like calling them and letting them know that there's a bomb in their house or in their car. You know, when you were in high school and you thought it was really funny to send all of those magazines or pizzas to somebody's house? Yeah, that was harassment, and that was illegal. So ordering things without the other person's knowledge or consent, using their name, is harassment, is a crime. And it's in the assault code. One of the newer things that's been added is essentially revenge porn. It's not called that in the code, obviously, but it is disseminating, publishing, distributing pictures that you have of somebody who is nude or engaged in a sex act without their consent. So yay, the legislature kind of tried to be with the times, if you will, and create some kind of a revenge porn addition to harassment. False reporting to law enforcement, specifically targeting somebody. Harassment is a misdemeanor. There's no felony crimes of harassment. Another part that is newer is using GPS to track somebody. So without the consent of somebody placing a GPS device either on them or like in their car, on their purse, etc., so that you can track them without legitimate purpose. It's unauthorized GPS, whether the person knows that it's there or not. So if I don't want my partner tracking me with GPS, but I know in fact that they are tracking me with GPS, that can be unauthorized. And certainly if I don't know it's there and they keep showing up and I don't know how they keep showing up, and I find out that, yeah, that toy that they hung from my car mirror is actually got a GPS device in it, that certainly is part of this. So those are a couple changes to Iowa law. I'm not aware of any changes under federal law, but things that would relate to stalking is anything that's traveling from one state to another. So traveling from one state to another to commit domestic violence might be a crime that could be charged, given particularly if you are serving an area that adjoins one of the other states, if you're in a border county. Of course, traveling back and forth between states specifically to commit stalking is a crime, and traveling between states to violate a protection order is a federal crime as well. So all of those cases would go through your federal prosecutor's office, not your local county person. Sometimes if you're not getting traction with a local county person and it is something that is cross states, maybe it's worthwhile to go have a conversation with your federal prosecutor and see if you can get some kind of attention and traction there instead. They reportedly in the past prioritized domestic violence cases. Your mileage will vary. Obviously, you can't have a case in the legal system or prosecute a case without evidence, which means that you're going to need cooperation from law enforcement, and law enforcement have a number of challenges with stalking cases. And one of them is simply finding where to grab hold of a case, finding how to frame it, because it's often hard for them to recognize. It's often not just one single little thing or one moment in time, the way they're used to thinking of events and incidents. It can be little tiny things that normally may not seem significant and might even be part of your standard romantic behavior. But it's once they're linked together that they become something else. That's a little complex and very different from most of the cases that they're dealing with. Stalkers, because they are so persistent, they kind of tend to be obsessive. They're not easily deterred from their behavior. So the usual things of, well, we're going to have a talk with that person and they'll cut it out or get an order for protection and everything will stop. Those things are not as likely to work with stalkers, especially if it's somebody who's already really, really escalated. Stalkers many of them continue after conviction. What else? One of the things is that because you're talking about incidents that may take place in a lot of different locations or across jurisdictions, like I might be stalking you. You're in Story County and I'm in Boone County, and I'm stalking you through the internet or through phone calls or whatever. That's multiple jurisdictions there. So sometimes what can happen is a handoff of say, the jurisdiction that the victim is located in, saying, well, the crime isn't originating from here, it's originating from that other place where the person doing it is, so you need to go talk to them. And those people saying, well, the crime isn't happening here because the victim is happening, they're receiving it over in that county there, you need to go talk to them, and they'll pass it back and forth. That they really have to figure out how to work together as across multiple jurisdictions. And if your target person lives in one jurisdiction and they work or attend school at another, and there might be, that stalker might be impacting multiple people in multiple places in multiple small ways, it just becomes a really complex web of tiny things. That's a hard thing for the police to kind of get their hooks in a lot of the time, particularly if they don't see it as serious and if they don't see the target as important and worthy of their attention. Nevertheless, there are some advantages for law enforcement. And one of the biggest ones is they know who it is. There's a lot of crimes where there's no suspect. Oh, your car was broken into. We don't know who did it, and the chances of us solving that are pretty slender. But the fact that they actually have a really good idea of who the offender is a huge advantage, just from the start. Another thing that's to their advantage is often that person is really proud of their behavior and thinks that there's nothing wrong with it, and that they are simply persistent and devoted and just, and their behavior can be vindicated, and they're often willing to tell people what they're doing. That can assist an officer in their investigation. A really good question for an officer to ask somebody who's stalking is, tell me how your behavior is being misunderstood. That's a lovely engagement alignment, and that person will often be willing to say exactly what they're doing and why their target is so wrong for not understanding or responding to these loving or just behaviors. And of course, because stalking is a continuous thing rather than a one-time event, maybe the police couldn't intervene or respond on one time, but guess what? There's going to be other opportunities, and other opportunities to collect evidence, other opportunities to document and piece together events. So documentation. The earlier that police can intervene, earlier they can document stalking incidents, the greater chance of intervening before the person escalates worse often. Let's talk about some of the evidence that your clients can collect. I'm not going to go into deep text safety stuff, but there's all kinds of training on text safety, and I would encourage you and your clients to seek that out. They need to collect anything that they have received, whether that's an email or a gift. So my source materials say, oh, there can be latent prints and DNA on notes and gifts. Yeah, that's true. So I did leave it in there, but I got to tell you, the budget for running DNA tests is so slender. I don't know what it is today, but I can tell you that a couple years ago, I was told by the state coroner that even when it came to homicide cases, they had enough budget to run like 4 DNA tests. And so the problem is, though, in that investigation, you had to pick which particular 4 things you wanted to run. And if you picked the wrong things, you just didn't have any relevant DNA evidence. And it might have been the next test tube that was important to test, but that wasn't the one that was picked out as the best bet. And so it was never run. Given that, the chances of them deciding to run DNA evidence on stalking is pretty slender. But I've kept it in there. Just so I could say, don't get your hopes up. Prints are another matter. Prints are not all that expensive to run. Any voicemail, any evidence from the phone company. There's the well, I'll talk about it later. The records, no, I'll talk about it right now. See, I'm talking so much that I'm not even looking at my PowerPoint to keep it in line with what I'm talking about. The police do have the ability to go in and get phone records. The problem with that is the speed with which like phone and email records have to be gathered, because those big companies are churning over data, so much data at such a rate that it doesn't exist for very long. In other words, they are erasing and replacing pretty quickly. So they can go and get a subpoena, send it to the email provider, if you will, and they can often go back a week, but the chances of them going back a year is pretty slender. They can get search warrants for the suspect's place of work, for their home. Often these things, the photos or cards, maybe they got a letter from your client at one point. Sometimes they have little notes or little drawings on them that can be evidence of threat. Sometimes they can be evidence of intent and state of mind. So that can be helpful. They might find personal belongings that they have acquired without permission from that target. I can think of some stolen underwear. I can think of a lot of stolen like address books and information on, like tax records and things like that were stolen. They can find proof that person has been surveilling their target. Equipment that they've used to survey their target. One thing I was told by a police chief one time is that they've got all kinds of equipment that is used and is bought and used primarily for drug-related cases, and that they love using that equipment. That's like the super spy stuff. And what the chief suggested to me is framing the opportunity to use their super spy stuff to stalk the stalker might pique the department's interest or a particular officer's interest in a way. In other words, it may not care about the case, but the opportunity to use the stuff might be pretty enticing. And essentially having them stalk the stalker to collect evidence, as well as collecting what might already be there simply because the person followed somebody through the bank teller and there was, the bank security camera outside. Let's see. Yeah, I've already said they have to work with other jurisdictions and collect any information that might already be there. One of the problems is even in connecting names, like, okay, this is a stalking case about one particular person, but 2 jurisdictions over, there was an incident with the police there, but it was with the target's cousin, and that, so it may be hard to connect that, that cousin's name and that situation is actually part of this stalking case over here. So the thing about stalking cases is they're often intense and they often require a lot of coordination and really advocacy in terms of going out and helping to collect that evidence and working together and kind of putting the puzzle pieces together and then presenting them to the police. Police solve crimes with physical evidence only 1/3 of the time. The majority of the time, cases are solved through victim and eyewitness reports, through confessions, through people coming in and admitting that they did it. So that's in the sense of the importance of witness, taking witness statements. That's critical in stalking cases as well. And really, that ability to interview and interrogate is where it's at in police work. Being able to go and talk to the suspect might, in fact, have a deterrent effect, particularly if you're talking about somebody who's a lower risk person and who has things to lose. They're largely pro-social. They don't want people to know. They don't want this to impact their job. They don't want to ruin their reputation. That might be enough for them to knock it off. In some cases, interviewing the suspect can serve to intensify their interest in the victim, and it might make them feel like their access is going to be cut off, and so they become more desperate, if you will, and it can intensify the stalking. And I can't tell you what to look for to know which way it's going to go. I think we're back again to asking your client, how do you think that person's going to respond if the police show up at their door? What do you think that they'll do? There isn't as much, because that requirement of proving fear in the court is now not there. You simply have to show that a reasonable person would be afraid. There isn't as much requirement to show fear in order to prove a court case. But I do think it can be important to be able to document fear, to take the case to the police or to the prosecutor for consideration, if that is the route that your client wants to go. So if you can show not only that these things have happened, but the result of them. Your person has had to move multiple times. They have had to get phone numbers multiple times. They have friends and coworkers who've been impacted. Their employer has thrown the person out for trespassing several times. All that kind of stuff can help to document that it is, in fact, a serious situation. So this is all part of putting the puzzle pieces together to show the picture. Did they go out and get a dog? And all of these things here that are about documenting fear actually are also some good steps that a survivor could take, changing their work schedule and their route and doing it on a rotating basis, so they're harder to pinpoint where they're going to be and when. I don't know about buying pepper spray or guns as being a reasonable, not reasonable. That's not something that I would suggest because of how easy those things can be turned against people. We know that when people get a firearm for their safety, they are far more likely to be hurt by that firearm than they are to be able to use that to protect themselves. So going and getting a firearm increases your chances of being injured or killed. But some of these other things, getting a smoke detector, a lot of the arson that happens is actually domestic violence related and can be part of stalking. So a $20, $30 smoke detector can be a great safety thing, and making sure that the batteries are fresh, that is something that I would advocate for any client, and it's something that's easily doable, and they can feel like they have some kind of control and some kind of way of preventing at least one issue. I talked about police, the things that are in their court as advantages. The fact that this is a general intent crime and they only have to prove 2 incidents are great for prosecutors. Let's talk about what prosecutors are then up against. The things that the defense uses most often are about that intent. Oh, well, I didn't mean to, and I had no idea the person didn't like the stuff that I was sending. And I certainly would never have done that if I'd known that they were afraid. Now that I say that, it's kind of interesting how with some of the Me Too stuff that's happening, that you're hearing the same excuses. Well, I didn't know that they didn't want my attention. Well, I didn't know that they would feel intimidated by that horrible sexual harassment in the workplace that I committed. So I didn't mean to. That wasn't my intent. I intended it to be a true apology. I intended it to be a loving act. Well, I didn't know because the victim was sending me mixed messages. They would say no, and then they would say yes. So I didn't know what was going on. And of course, because so many of the cases are domestic violence related and so often they're kids, they can often use the children as the reason why they did anything. Well, they won't let me see my kids. This is part and parcel of my visitation with the kids. I wasn't intending to stalk. It's just that my children were at this sporting event, and so I just wanted to see my kids participate in the sporting event, you name it. Like any defense case, they often want to make the case about the conflict in the relationship rather than about the defendant's conduct. They want to tell the story of why it was a volatile relationship, it was rocky, there was all of this conflict going on, the survivor is a difficult person and they don't know what they want, all of those kinds of things. And of course, minimizing, denying, and blaming. Just about anything on the power and control wheel fits as a defense strategy. And it's really important for prosecutors to remember that the source of the conflict and the source of the violence are two separate things, and that Iowa only criminalizes one. Iowa doesn't criminalize conflict in a relationship. It criminalizes violence in a relationship. It criminalizes stalking in a relationship. And to kind of keep that message on point to a judge or to a jury. Some successful trial themes for the prosecution to keep coming back to is that this is everyone's worst nightmare. How many movies are there out there about stalking? So kind of hooking into that and creating that sense of fear for the jury. This person wouldn't take no for an answer. They didn't listen to their partner saying no. They didn't listen to the law enforcement saying no. They didn't listen to the judge saying no. They think they're above the law. They think they're better than everybody. They are scary. They'll stop at nothing. Just hammering home those themes is often one of the best ways to get the jury to take it seriously and to get the conviction. I'm almost at the end of my time. I'm almost at the end of my PowerPoint. And I just wanted to throw out a few suggestions for stalking victims and also make sure that you know about the National Stalking Resource Center. Repeatedly telling a stalker that you don't want to talk to them is still talking to them and can be perceived by the stalker as being a mixed message. And if I constantly call you and I leave 40 messages on your voicemail saying, please just talk to me, please do it, and finally you get so worn down that you call me, then the only thing I've learned is that the cost to me of getting you to talk to me is 40 messages. And so that means all I need to do is call you another 40 times to get another chance. I will say always that survivor is the best expert on their partner, and because their partner's risk isn't a static thing, it changes day to day or moment to moment, that they are still the best measure. But as that person is weighing what's in their safety, they need to weigh the fact that not having contact can often be safer, even when it feels like, okay, they've called me 39 times. Now they've called me 40 times. How many more times will they call me? 41, 42, 43. If you are trapped alone with somebody, it may not be the moment to stand up to them and say, look, I don't want anything to do with you. In that moment, it might be best to leave some kind of I'm not sure. I'm just so confused right now and overwhelmed. There's been so much going on, until you can get away from them, until you can get to a public place, until you can be in a point of safety. So, these are suggestions that are out there for survivors, and I think they are generally good advice, but in that moment, whatever that person does, that's okay. They did what they needed to do. Getting in a car, agreeing to get in a car and go with somebody somewhere is often not a good idea. Often that is a kidnapping. Often there is nothing good at the end of that car ride, even if it seems like this will just calm them down and they promised they'd drop me off at home. Maybe not so much. People quite often want to get a new phone number, want to get a new phone, whatever. If they have the financial resources, it can be better to, instead of changing their phone number, it can often be better to get a new one and leave the other one active, because once that phone number is gone, that stalker knows, oh, that phone number is no longer active. They must have got a new one, and now they can begin the search to find out the new one. If the old one is never canceled, they're not triggered to know that there's a new one, and so it might actually be more successful, and the old phone number can just be that stalker's personal, private phone voicemail answering service that can just be used to collect evidence. I know that is not a financially feasible solution for everybody, but where it is, or where with a little access to client assistance it might be, it can be helpful. There are lots of different forms of keeping documentation, keeping diaries. There's different log forms, and you can download them from the National Stalking Resource Center. Let's say, here's the date, here's what happened, here's any witnesses, if the person called law enforcement, what's the names and numbers of the officers that responded, a place for the incident report if there was an incident report filed, and they can keep a really formal log. But even having a diary or journal where they write stuff down that they're not sure, like I came home and I had a creepy feeling because I thought I locked my fence and the fence was unlocked, even that is better than nothing. I talked about changing things up to make it hard to track. I had a sister that was stalked for a little while, and we switched cars around. So she would drive a couple different cars to work and switch her schedule around just to make it more difficult. Shredding mail, having your parents shred. If you're going to call anybody, you're probably calling your parents. And so if I, as a stalker, can just steal your parents' garbage and go through their cell phone records, I might be able to find your new cell phone number. So not only for you shredding your documents and information, but trying to get the people who are close to you that stalker might go to for information, to get them to be also careful about identifying material. Most survivors who are being stalked have to move. And it's not fair, it's not just, it's not right, it just is. And that's simply a fact. Employers can be important places. When I said that one of my sisters had been stalked, this guy actually called her employer as though he was somebody that she had applied for a job with, and and wanted to get a recommendation for her as an employee. Got her new home phone number from the supervisor that talked with him, because that supervisor wasn't aware of what was going on, and all they knew was that somebody had called and there was a potential here for a good employee to have a better position, and they wanted to help them on their way, and so they were willing to give all kinds of information, right? So employers are a place where stalkers can sometimes get lots of stuff, and even if they don't know where you're living anymore, they often know where you're working. It is sometimes a lot harder to change your job than to change where you live. Most places talk about listening to that inner voice, and that how often we are trained to ignore, to poo-poo, or to simply be polite. But that when you're being stalked in particular, it's time to listen to your intuition and act on it, even if later on you would feel silly, even if later on you would feel like, or people would say that you blew something out of proportion, that it's better to be safe than sorry, and to learn to listen to that inner voice. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. Okay. There's a National Stalking Resource Center. Chances are that you might not be able to click on it. Will click and open, but if you don't want to do that, just Google National Stalking Resource Center. It'll come up. It has information there. It has a manual for survivors. It has stuff about state to state. It has resources for prosecutors and office and law enforcement. It's got all kinds of stuff that survivors can feel empowered by reading and feel like they're not alone and learn about. It's got connections to information on tech stalking. It's really a wonderful resource, and I would encourage you to bookmark that in your computer. Okay, it's 1 o'clock and I am done. I bet you're done too. Any comments or questions? I've tried to keep a lookout, but I don't see any up there now that I didn't attend to. So I'll be quiet for a minute. And I will see what I can find about the restraining order, see if I can find a copy of that and get it sent out as part of the post email that they send out. I don't know what they call it. Okay, well, thank you. And I guess I will hit you up next time for the next webinar. I don't know what it's about. Actually, I think the next one that's scheduled is not me. The next one is Zeb, and he's talking about getting help paying for child care costs. So I'm actually quite interested in what he has to say about that myself. So maybe I will see you all as an attendee on that day. And stay warm. And that's it. Bye-bye, all.